He discarded his 3 children to protect his bloodline. Years later, he regretted everything. The letter was sitting on the kitchen table when Richard came home that evening. It was a plain white envelope, no return address, and his name was written on the front in handwriting he did not recognize. He stood in the doorway of his house for a long moment, his briefcase still in his hand, his jacket still on, and stared at it. Something about that envelope made the air feel thin. He did not know why. He had received hundreds of letters in his life, but this one felt different. This one felt like a door that, once opened, could never be closed again. Richard Okafor was 41 years old and had spent every single year of his adult life building something. As a boy, he had grown up in a 2-room house in a small town outside of Lagos where the electricity went out 3 nights a week, and his mother cooked with firewood because the gas was too expensive. His father had been a quiet man who worked as a low-level clerk in a government office and came home every evening smelling of sweat and disappointment. Richard had watched his father carefully as a child. He had studied the way his father sat at the dinner table with the look of a man who had accepted defeat. And he had made a decision, very young, that he would never become that man. He had earned a scholarship to university through sheer will. He had studied business and economics. He had graduated near the top of his class. And then he had moved to England with 200 pounds in his pocket and a hunger that had no name, and he had started from nothing. He had done jobs that broke his back. He had lived in a shared apartment with 6 other men, where the bathroom door did not lock and the heating only worked half the time. But he had saved every penny. He had read every book he could find about money, about investment, about property, and slowly, painfully, year by year, he had built himself into something. By the time he was 35, Richard owned a mid-sized property development company based in Birmingham. He had offices. He had staff. He had a car that cost more than his father had earned in 10 years. He had a house in a quiet, leafy neighborhood, with a garden that his wife Clara tended on weekend mornings. He had 3 children. Emeka was 9 years old, a serious boy who liked mathematics and asked too many questions. Adaeze was 7, a girl with her mother's wide eyes and her father's stubbornness. Tobena was 5, still small enough to run and throw himself into Richard's arms when he came home in the evenings. Richard had everything, and he knew it. He was proud of it in the way that only a man who had started from nothing can be proud, with a fierce, almost desperate pride that never fully relaxed. Because somewhere deep inside him, the boy from that 2-room house was always watching, and always afraid that it could all disappear. He set his briefcase down by the door and walked to the table. He picked up the envelope and turned it over. There was nothing written on the back. He opened it carefully. Inside was a single sheet of paper. The handwriting was small and neat. He read it once, then he read it again, and then he stood there in his own kitchen, in his own beautiful house, and felt the floor shift beneath him. The letter was from a man named Gerald. Richard knew Gerald, though not well. Gerald was a distant cousin who had grown up in the same town in Nigeria, a man Richard had seen perhaps 4 or 5 times in the last decade at family events. Gerald was the kind of man who always seemed to know things about other people, the kind of man who collected secrets the way other people collected stamps. Richard had never trusted him, but he had never had a reason to confront him either. The letter said that Gerald had information that Richard deserved to know. It said that during the first years of Richard's marriage, when Richard had been traveling frequently for work, trying to build the business, Clara had been seen spending time with another man, a man named Adrian. The letter said that Adrian had been a close friend of Clara's from university, a man she had known long before Richard, and that the nature of their friendship during those years had been more than just friendship. The letter said that Gerald had seen things with his own eyes. It said that Gerald was telling Richard because he respected him, because Richard was family, because he believed that a man had the right to know the truth about his own household. Richard read the letter 3 times. Each time, he felt something cold spread a little further through his chest. He folded the letter carefully and put it back in the envelope. He walked upstairs, changed out of his work clothes, and came back down to the kitchen, just as Clara was calling the children for dinner. He sat at the table. He ate his food. He answered his children's questions. He said the normal things. But something inside him had gone very quiet. Something had locked itself away behind a door that he could already feel closing. He did not tell Clara about the letter that night. He did not tell her the next day, or the day after that. He kept the envelope in the inside pocket of his winter coat, the coat he only wore in January and February, the coat Clara never touched. He told himself he was thinking. He told himself he was being careful, being rational, being the kind of man who did not react without evidence. But the truth was simpler and darker than that. The truth was that the letter had landed on something that was already inside him. A fear he had carried for years without naming it. A fear that something he had built could be taken from him. A fear that he was not what he believed himself to be. Clara noticed the change in him within a week. She was a perceptive woman. She had grown up as the middle child in a family of 5, and middle children learn early to read the mood of a room. She watched Richard come home in the evenings and sit at the dinner table with a distance in his eyes that had not been there before. She watched him put the children to bed, without his usual warmth, without the stories he liked to tell them, without the jokes that made Emeka groan, and Adeze laugh, and Tobena hide his face in the pillow. She asked him once, gently, if everything was all right. He said yes. He said he was just tired. She accepted that, because she loved him, and because she had no reason yet to believe that the man she had married for 11 years was quietly building a case against her. 2 weeks after the letter arrived, Richard did something he had never done before. He called a private investigator. The man came highly recommended by a solicitor friend of Richard's. His name was Colin Marsh, a thin, quiet man in his early 50s, who wore plain clothes and spoke in a voice so neutral it seemed designed not to be remembered. Richard met him in a coffee shop near his office on a Wednesday afternoon, and told him, in as few words as possible, what he needed. He needed to know if there was any truth to what the letter said. He needed information about Adrian. He needed to know if Clara had any contact with this man. He paid Colin a significant amount of money, and told him to be discreet. Colin was very good at his job. Within 3 weeks, he had a full report. He had traced Adrian, who turned out to be a graphic designer living in Bristol. He had found no current contact between Adrian and Clara, not a single message, not a call, not a meeting. But he had found something else. He had found, through records and timelines, that Adrian had been in Birmingham during a period roughly 10 years earlier, the same period when Emeka was conceived. He had found no proof of anything. No photographs, no witnesses, no messages. Nothing that would hold up to any standard of reasonable evidence. But Richard did not approach the information the way a judge would. He approached it the way a frightened man does, looking for confirmation of the thing he already feared, finding it in shadows and coincidences. He made an appointment with a genetics clinic. He gave a false name. He said it was for personal reasons. The clinic told him how a paternity test worked, what was needed, how long it would take. He went home that evening and looked at his children at the dinner table. Emeka was doing homework on the corner of the table, his tongue pressed between his teeth, the way he did when he was concentrating. Adaize was telling Clara a long, winding story about something that had happened at school, using her hands dramatically the way she always did. Tobena had fallen asleep on the sofa, and Clara had put a blanket over him without interrupting the conversation. It was a perfectly ordinary evening. It was the kind of evening that most men would walk into and feel grateful. Richard sat down at the table and watched his family, and he felt nothing except the cold, spreading certainty that everything he had built might be built on a lie. He collected the DNA samples himself, quietly, over several days. Cotton swabs from the children's toothbrushes, a hair from each pillow. He sent them to the clinic under his false name, and then he waited. The waiting was the worst part. He had always been a man of action. Waiting was not in his nature. He dealt with the wait by working more, staying later at the office, taking on projects that kept his mind from going still. Clara noticed the longer hours and said nothing at first. But when the third weekend passed, and Richard had been at the office both days, she asked him directly. He told her there was a major development deal that needed his attention. She believed him. She had always believed him, because he had never given her a reason not to. The results arrived in the post on a Tuesday morning, addressed to the false name. At the post office box Richard had opened specifically for this purpose. He picked them up on his lunch break and sat in his car, in a quiet car park, and opened the envelope with hands that were not entirely steady. The report was 3 pages long and written in clinical, technical language. He read it carefully. He read the conclusion twice, and then he sat back in his seat and stared through the windscreen at the gray November sky. The results were inconclusive. The report explained, in careful language, that the samples provided were insufficient in quality or quantity to produce a reliable result. The clinic recommended that the process be repeated, with proper cheek swabs collected under clinical supervision, which would produce a definitive result. The report was careful to state that inconclusive did not mean positive or negative. It meant that no conclusion could be drawn from the current samples. Richard did not read it that way. He read it the way a man reads something when he has already decided what he believes. He read it as confirmation. He read the word inconclusive and heard it as suspicious. He told himself that if everything had been fine, the result would have been clear. He told himself that the ambiguity was itself a kind of answer. He folded the report, put it in his coat pocket next to Gerald's letter, and drove back to his office. That afternoon, he called his solicitor. He did not tell Clara. He did not seek a second test. He did not sit across from his wife of 11 years and ask her a single question. He simply began, very quietly, very carefully, to plan a different future. One in which 3 children who had called him father every day of their lives would be removed from his plans, his will, and eventually, his world. The cruelest part of what Richard did next was how ordinary it looked from the outside. He did not shout. He did not become violent. He did not make any dramatic declarations. He simply began to withdraw, and he did it so slowly and so quietly that by the time anyone realized what was happening, the damage was already deep. He stopped telling Emeka bedtime stories. He said he was tired. He stopped attending Adaize's school performances. He said he had meetings. He stopped taking Tobena to the park on Saturday mornings, the trip that the boy had lived for every single week, the trip during which Tobena would run ahead and turn back every few seconds to make sure his father was still there. He simply stopped going. He said other things had come up. Clara watched it happen and felt a quiet terror building inside her. She did not know what was wrong. She did not know about the letter. She did not know about the investigation. She did not know about the clinic, or the report, or the solicitor. All she knew was that the man she had married was pulling away from his own children, and she did not understand why, and every time she tried to ask him, he deflected, or became cold, or changed the subject so smoothly that she found herself standing in the middle of a room, wondering how the conversation had ended. Emeka noticed. Children always notice. He was 9 years old, and he was a sharp, watchful boy, and he felt the change in his father, the way you feel a change in the weather before the clouds arrive. He started staying at the dinner table a little longer, asking his father questions about work, about buildings, about the projects his company was doing, trying in the way that children do to reach a parent who has moved somewhere they cannot follow. Richard answered the questions, but his answers were short. They had no warmth in them. And Emeka, who was 9 and very smart but still a child, began to believe, very quietly, that he had done something wrong, that something about him had caused his father to move away. Adaize did not ask questions. She watched. She was 7 years old, and she had inherited something from her mother that was partly a gift and partly a wound, the ability to feel everything very deeply and to hold it very quietly. She started drawing more, spending long hours in her room with her coloring books, filling page after page with pictures she never showed anyone. Tobena did not understand any of it. He was 5. He only knew that his father no longer took him to the park, and that when he climbed into his father's lap in the evenings the way he always had, something was different. His father's arms would close around him, but they felt like the arms of someone who was thinking about something else. Tobena would press his face into his father's shirt and breathe in the familiar smell of him, and feel, without having words for it, that something was slipping away. Richard noticed all of it. He was not a man without eyes. He could see what his withdrawal was doing to his children. But he had convinced himself, by that point, that what he was doing was necessary. He had convinced himself that he was a man who had been deceived, that his pride, his name, and his legacy were at stake, and that sentiment was a luxury he could not afford. He had convinced himself that the kindest thing he could do for everyone was to deal with this quietly and surgically, to remove himself and his assets from a situation that he believed had been built on dishonesty, and to build something new. He met with his solicitor twice more before the end of the year. He began quietly moving assets. He restructured parts of the company. He set up a separate account. None of it was illegal. All of it was deliberate, and all of it was done in the calm, methodical way that Richard did everything, with the discipline of a man who had once had nothing and had taught himself that emotion was the enemy of progress. Christmas came. The children were excited. Clara had decorated the house, put up the tree, bought gifts, planned a day that she had poured herself into because she had felt, all through the autumn, that the family needed something to hold it together. They opened presents in the morning. The children were happy, in the way that children are on Christmas morning, loud and bright and completely present. Richard sat in his chair and watched them, and felt something move in his chest, something that might have been love, or grief, or both. Clara caught his eye across the room, and smiled at him. It was the smile she had given him for 11 years. It was the smile that had made him fall in love with her. He looked at it for a moment, and then he looked away. He had made his decision. He was going to see it through. By February of the following year, he had spoken to his solicitor about divorce. He had a plan. It was not kind, but he had convinced himself that it was honest. What he could not see, or would not see, was that the entire structure of his plan was built on a foundation of unverified suspicion. A letter from a man he had never trusted, a damaged DNA sample that meant nothing, and a fear so old and so deep that it had been waiting his whole life for something to latch onto. He was 41 years old. He had built everything from nothing. He believed he was protecting something sacred. He was destroying the only thing that had ever truly belonged to him. And the worst part, the part that would take him many long years to understand, was that he did it all in silence. He never asked. He never confronted. He never gave Clara a single chance to speak. He simply decided, alone in his own mind, what the truth was, and he began to act on it. And 3 children went to bed every night, in a house that was slowly growing colder, without knowing why, without having done anything wrong, without any understanding that the man who had held them when they were born was quietly preparing to let them go. Clara noticed the solicitor's letter on a Thursday morning in March. It arrived in the regular post, in a plain white envelope, with a law firm's name printed in the corner. She had been in the kitchen making breakfast when she heard the post come through the door. She picked it up from the mat with one hand, a piece of toast in the other, and stood in the hallway reading the name of the firm. She did not recognize it. She set the envelope on the kitchen counter and went back to making Tobena's sandwiches for school. It was only after the children had been taken to school, and she was alone in the house, that she opened it. She read it standing at the kitchen counter. She read it 3 times, and then she put it down very carefully, as if it were made of something fragile, and stood there in the silence of her own home, and felt the world she had built crack quietly beneath her feet. The letter was a formal notification that Richard had instructed the firm to begin proceedings for divorce. It outlined the process, the timeline, the next steps. It was written in the careful, impersonal language of legal documents. It was the first time Clara had any idea that her marriage was ending. Not because she had been unaware that something was wrong, but because in all the months of Richard's withdrawal, in all the cold evenings and the canceled plans and the growing distance, he had never once looked at her and told her the truth. She called him at his office. His assistant said he was in a meeting. She called his mobile. It rang out. She sat at the kitchen table and waited. He called back 2 hours later, and when she answered, his voice was flat and controlled, the voice of a man who had been preparing for this conversation for a long time. She asked him what was happening. He said he thought it was time they went their separate ways. She asked him why. He said they had grown apart. She told him that was not an answer. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said that there were things he had come to understand, things that changed how he felt about the future. She asked him what things. He said he did not want to discuss it over the phone. She told him to come home that evening and talk to her. He said he would. He came home at 7. The children were at the table finishing their homework. He sat with them for a few minutes, helped Emeka with a maths problem, said goodnight to Adaeze, kissed Tobena on the top of his head, and then he and Clara went into the sitting room and closed the door and sat across from each other in the chairs they had sat in for 11 years, and he told her, in a measured, quiet voice, that he believed the marriage was over. She asked him if there was someone else. He said no. She asked him if he was unhappy. He said it was not about happiness. She looked at him for a long time. She had known this man since she was 24 years old. She had watched him work himself to exhaustion building a life for them. She had stood beside him in hospital rooms when the children were born. She had been there on the nights when the business nearly failed, when the deals fell through, when he sat at the kitchen table at 2 in the morning staring at spreadsheets with the look of a man who was fighting something invisible. She had never left him. She had never considered it. She asked him directly what had changed. He said nothing had changed. She did not believe him. She knew him well enough to see that he was not telling her everything. She pushed. She was not a woman who gave up easily. She asked again and again, gently, then more urgently, and finally with the raw desperation of a woman who can feel her life changing shape and cannot stop it. He sat through all of it with a stillness that was not peace but control. And when she finally went quiet, he told her he had spoken to his solicitor, and that everything would be handled fairly. He did not mention Gerald's letter. He did not mention the private investigator. He did not mention the DNA test. He never told her any of it, not that night, not in the weeks that followed, not ever. He simply proceeded, with the cold efficiency that had always been his greatest professional strength and his greatest personal weakness, to dismantle their family. The weeks that followed were among the strangest of Clara's life. She was living in her own home with her husband, going through the routines of daily life, feeding the children, taking them to school, making dinner, folding laundry, and yet everything felt like it was happening inside a dream that was slowly becoming a nightmare. Richard was not cruel. He was polite. He was present in the mornings, and sometimes in the evenings, but there was nothing between them anymore. No warmth, no conversation, no small moments of connection. He had pulled himself away so completely that sharing a house with him felt like living with a very convincing photograph of a man she used to know. She told her older sister Catherine. Catherine was a practical woman with sharp edges and a very low tolerance for nonsense. She came to the house on a Saturday afternoon while Richard was at work, sat at Clara's kitchen table with a cup of tea, and listened to everything. When Clara finished, Catherine asked one question. She asked if Clara had done anything that might have given Richard a reason to feel this way. Clara looked at her sister for a long time, and then she said no, absolutely not. She had been faithful to Richard for every single day of their marriage. She had never looked at another man with anything other than ordinary, passing human notice. She did not understand where any of this was coming from. She did not know about Gerald. She did not know about Adrian. She did not know that somewhere, in the pocket of a winter coat she had never touched, was a letter that had been quietly setting fire to everything. Catherine told her to get her own solicitor immediately. Clara did. The divorce proceedings were not ugly, not in the way that some divorces are, with shouting and accusations and scenes that the children could hear. They were quiet and procedural, which in some ways was worse. Quiet divorces have a particular kind of damage. They do not make noise, they simply happen, and by the time the children understand what the noise was about, it is already over. Emeka was 10 by the time the proceedings began in earnest. He understood more than his parents knew. He had started listening at doors, not because he was deliberately trying to spy, but because he was a child, in a house where the adults had stopped explaining things, and he was trying to understand what was happening to him. He heard the word solicitor. He heard the word proceedings. He did not fully understand what these words meant, but he understood the weight they carried in the voices of the adults around him. He started sleeping less well. His teacher at school mentioned to Clara that Emeka's work had slipped, and that he seemed distracted. Clara thanked her and went home, and sat in the car in the driveway for 10 minutes before she could go inside. Adaize had stopped talking as much. She was 8 now, and she had always been a child who expressed herself through words and stories, who filled every silence with something. But that year she became quieter, and the quiet had a quality to it that was different from ordinary childhood quiet. It was the quiet of someone who has learned that speaking does not change anything. He understood only that his father was often not there, and that when his father was there, something was missing. One evening he asked Clara where his father slept now, because he had noticed the spare room was being used. Clara told him, as gently as she could, that his father was staying in a different part of the house for a little while. Tobena accepted this with the trusting simplicity of a 6-year-old who has not yet learned to be suspicious of half-answers. But he went to bed that night holding his blanket tighter than usual, and Clara stood in the doorway watching him for a long time. Richard moved out in June. He took very few things. He moved into a furnished flat in the city, close to his office. He had arranged for maintenance payments to be made to Clara, which were fair by legal standards if not by any other. He had already spoken to his solicitor about his will, and had revised it earlier in the year, quietly removing all 3 children as beneficiaries. This was the part that Clara did not know about, and would not discover for some time. The part that would later, when it came to light, feel like the coldest thing he had ever done. On the day he left, Emeka watched from the upstairs window. He stood there in his school uniform, still holding his school bag, because he had just come in from the bus, and he watched his father load a few bags into the car below. Richard looked up once. He saw Emeka in the window. They looked at each other for a moment. Richard raised his hand. Emeka did not raise his. He stepped back from the window and went to his room and closed the door. Adaeze was in the garden when Richard left. She had been out there for an hour, sitting on the grass, drawing in a notebook. She heard the car start. She did not look up. She kept drawing, her pen moving in small, careful circles across the page. Richard walked to the gate and paused. He could see the back of her head, her braids, the curve of her shoulders. He stood there for a moment. Then he opened the gate and got in the car and drove away. Tobena was the one who ran. He had been in the kitchen with Clara, and when he heard the front door close, something in his small body knew before his mind did. He ran out of the kitchen and through the hallway and out the front door, and he saw his father's car at the end of the driveway, the engine running, the red taillights bright against the gray afternoon. He ran. He ran the way a 5-year-old runs, with everything he had, arms pumping, feet slapping on the pavement, calling out for his father in a voice that carried all the way to the end of the road. The car did not stop. Richard heard his son's voice. He heard it clearly through the window he had left cracked open. He gripped the steering wheel. He kept driving. He told himself he was doing what had to be done. He told himself that in time, everything would be cleaner and simpler, and that perhaps this pain now was better than a longer, drawn-out uncertainty. He told himself these things in a steady, rational voice, the voice he used when he needed to get through something difficult, and he kept driving, and the sound of Tobena's voice faded behind him. Clara came out and found Tobena standing at the end of the driveway, staring at the empty road. She picked him up and held him, and he buried his face in her shoulder and made no sound at all, which was somehow worse than crying. She stood there on the pavement, holding her youngest child, and stared at the space where her husband's car had been, and she thought about all the years she had given to a man who had walked away without ever telling her why, and she felt something inside her harden, not into bitterness, but into something more durable than that, into the kind of resolve that only comes to people who have been left standing alone and have decided that standing is still something they can do. Inside the house, behind a closed bedroom door, Emeka sat on the edge of his bed, with his school bag still over his shoulder, and told himself he did not care. He told himself it very firmly, the way you tell yourself something that isn't true but needs to become true quickly. Adaeze came in from the garden a few minutes later, with her notebook under her arm, and stood in the doorway of his room, and looked at him. They did not say anything to each other, but she went and sat beside him on the bed, and they sat there side by side, in the quiet of their house, and outside, they could hear the sound of their mother's footsteps coming back inside. What Clara did not know, sitting in her grief and confusion in the weeks after Richard left, was that the man who had just walked out of her family had done so based on a piece of paper that proved nothing, written by a man who had no motive except jealousy, interpreted by a mind that had never allowed itself to simply ask the one question that could have changed everything. What Richard did not know, driving away with his hands steady on the wheel, and his jaw set and his eyes dry, was that the results sitting in his coat pocket were not what he believed them to be. They were not a quiet confirmation of betrayal. They were a laboratory error. They were nothing. And the children he was leaving behind, the boy in the window who had not raised his hand, the girl in the garden who had not looked up, the small running figure that had disappeared in his rearview mirror, were his. All three of them. They had always been his. He would not learn that truth for a very long time. And by the time he did, the damage would be so deep and so wide that no amount of knowing could simply undo it. The year Richard moved into his flat was the year he turned 42, and for a man who had always moved with purpose and direction, those first months alone had a disorienting quality that he had not expected. He had expected to feel relief. He had expected the clarity that he believed came from removing a source of uncertainty from your life. He had spent months telling himself that once he was out of that house, once the situation was settled, he would be able to breathe again. What he found instead was that his flat was very quiet in the evenings, and that quiet had a texture he had not encountered before. He was not a man given to self-examination. He dealt with discomfort by working, and so he threw himself into the office with a focus that impressed his staff and concerned no one, because no one knew what was driving it. He took on a large development project in Manchester. He flew to meetings in London and Edinburgh. He answered emails at midnight and was in the office by 7 in the morning. He told himself he was building, always building. and that this was what he was meant to do. The divorce was finalized 9 months after he left. Clara's solicitor had been thorough and fair. The family home stayed with Clara and the children. The maintenance was settled. Everything was documented and signed and done. Richard received the final papers on a Wednesday afternoon and put them in his desk drawer without much ceremony. He had expected to feel something conclusive at that moment, some sense of a chapter properly closed. Instead, he sat at his desk for 20 minutes, staring at the wood grain on the surface, and then his assistant knocked and reminded him of a 3 o'clock call, and he picked up the phone and got on with it. He had not seen the children since he left. His solicitor had advised him on visitation arrangements that had been included in the divorce settlement, a reasonable schedule that any judge would have considered fair. He had agreed to it during the process. And then he had quietly, without drama, not used it. He had not called to arrange visits. He had not sent word that he was coming. The first visit window passed, and then the second, and then a month went by, and then 2. And each time he told himself he would sort it next week, next month, when the project in Manchester was done, when things were less busy. Clara did not chase him. She was not the kind of woman who would beg a man to be present for his own children, partly out of pride, and partly out of a growing understanding that begging would change nothing. She had reached a place of careful silence on the subject of Richard. She did not speak badly of him to the children. She did not explain his absence in terms that would burden them with her own feelings. When Emeka asked why his father never came, she said his father was very busy with work. When Adiaze drew a picture at school of her family, and came home with it, and stood quietly looking at it, before putting it face down in a drawer, Clara saw it, and said nothing, because she understood that some things needed to be carried quietly for a while, before they could be talked about out loud. When Tobena asked if his father was coming to his birthday, she said she would ask. She called Richard. He said he was away that week. She put the phone down, and went and bought Tobena the biggest birthday cake she could find, with his name on it in bright blue icing, and she invited every child from his class, and she stood in that garden in the afternoon sunshine, watching her youngest boy run around with his friends, and she made sure that day was full enough, that the absence did not leave too much room. Richard did not go to the birthday. He sent a card with money in it. It arrived 3 days late. What was happening inside Richard during this period was something he would have found very difficult to explain, not because it was complicated, but because he was not accustomed to looking at it directly. He had spent his entire adult life in motion, in action, moving toward the next thing. Stillness was not something he knew how to inhabit. And yet now, in the evenings in his flat, when the work was done, and the calls were finished, and the city outside his window had gone quiet, there was a stillness that would not be filled. He tried whiskey for a period, but it made him feel heavy and slow, and he did not like that, so he stopped. He tried the gym, and that helped during the session itself, but left him sitting in his car in the car park afterward feeling exactly as empty as before. He started watching long documentary films in the evenings, the kind about history and nature and exploration, things that required no emotional participation. He watched them and ate takeaway food, and went to bed and woke up and went to work. He told himself this was fine. He told himself he was rebuilding. He told himself that what he had done was correct and necessary, and that the discomfort was just the cost of doing the right thing. He had a vocabulary for self-justification that was very well developed, built up over 42 years of being a man who could not afford to doubt himself. But at 3 in the morning, sometimes, in the strange way that the mind works when the rest of the defenses are down, he would see Tobena's face. Not the face of the child running after the car, earlier than that. The face of Tobena at 2 years old, when Richard used to carry him on his shoulders around the house, and Tobena would grip his father's hair with both hands, laughing at the height. The world suddenly enormous and thrilling from up there, his father's hands solid and certain on his small legs. That face, that laugh, it would come to Richard at 3 in the morning, and he would lie in the dark and push it away, and eventually sleep would come, and in the morning he would get up and go to work and not think about it. It was 18 months after the divorce that Richard met Vivienne. He met her at a dinner organized by a business associate. She was 31 years old, 12 years younger than Richard, and she was beautiful in a very deliberate way, the kind of beauty that required maintenance and understood its own power. She had grown up comfortably, the daughter of a successful solicitor and a woman who had been a model in her 20s. She was charming at dinner and sharp in conversation, and laughed at the right moments. Richard found himself talking to her for most of the evening. He told himself he was not looking for anything. He told himself this was simply pleasant company. But over the dinners and the evenings, and the gradual closeness that follows when two people are willing and available, he found himself drawn to Vivienne in a way that had as much to do with what she was not, as with what she was. She had no history with him. She had no connection to what had happened. She was, in a sense, a blank page, and a man who has spent a year and a half trying not to think about the pages he has already written will find a blank page very appealing. He told Vivienne about his children on their third date. He said he had 3 children from a previous marriage, that it had been difficult, and that his relationship with the children was complicated. Vivienne nodded and said she understood. She did not ask many questions. He appreciated that. He did not tell her what he had believed about Clara. He did not tell her about Gerald's letter, or the DNA test. He had not told those things to anyone. They lived in a sealed-off compartment of him that he did not open. They were engaged within a year. Richard had a talent for efficiency, and he applied it to his personal life with the same dispatch he applied to everything else. Vivienne had expressed, fairly early on, that she wanted children, and Richard, who was now 44, was aware that time moved in one direction only. They married in a small ceremony at a hotel outside London. It was elegant and quiet, and nothing like the wedding he and Clara had had, which had been full of family and noise and dancing that went on until 2 in the morning. This was different. This was controlled. This was what Richard had decided a new beginning looked like. Throughout all of this, his 3 children continued to grow up without him. Emeka was 12 now, and the boy who had once asked his father endless questions about buildings and money had become quieter and more guarded. He had channeled his energy into school with a focus that sometimes alarmed his teachers, not because it was unhealthy, but because it had an intensity to it, a quality of someone trying to prove something to an audience that wasn't there. His marks were exceptional. He was in the top of his class in mathematics and science. He had a small, close group of friends, boys who were similarly serious and ambitious, and he moved through his school days with a self-contained dignity that was remarkable in a boy his age. He did not talk about his father. If anyone asked, he said simply that his parents were divorced. He said it the way you state a fact about the weather. Adaisy had begun writing, not drawing anymore, though she still did that occasionally, but writing. Stories, mostly. She filled notebooks with them, long, winding stories full of characters who felt things very deeply and did not always find easy resolutions. Her English teacher had noticed her talent when she was 9 and had been quietly encouraging her ever since. By the time she was 11, she had won 2 school writing competitions. She accepted the prizes with a small, contained smile and went home and put the certificates in a folder she kept at the back of her wardrobe. She did not show them to anyone at home, because home was a place where you were careful about taking up too much space with your feelings. Tobena had found his footing through friendship. He was a sociable child by nature, the kind of boy who walked into a room and made everyone feel comfortable. And he had built around himself, over the years since his father left, a network of friends who genuinely loved him. He was funny, and warm, and curious about people. His mother's family adored him. He had an uncle on Clara's side, her brother Dennis, who had stepped into his life with a gentle consistency, teaching him to ride a bicycle and then to play football, taking him to matches on Saturday afternoons, being present in the ordinary, unremarkable ways that matter more than any grand gesture. Tobena did not think about his father every day. Some days he did not think about him at all, but there were other days, smaller and quieter, when he would see a father and son doing something ordinary together, walking into a shop or watching something on a phone, leaning toward each other, with that easy closeness that fathers and sons develop over years of proximity, and he would feel something very briefly before he turned away. Richard and Vivienne's son Nathan was born in the spring of Richard's 45th year. Richard was in the room when he was born, and he felt something then that was both familiar and completely new. Familiar because he had felt something similar 3 times before. New because he let himself feel it this time without the fear underneath it. He held Nathan in the delivery room and felt the weight of the baby against his chest, and he let the feeling in, all of it, without armor. He told himself this was the family he had protected. He told himself that Nathan was the child who would carry his name forward, who would inherit what he had built, who would be the living proof that his life had meant something. He told himself that all the pain of the last few years had been leading to this correct and clean beginning, to this son who would be raised with certainty and intention. He threw himself into fatherhood with Nathan in the way he threw himself into everything, completely and strategically, and with enormous investment. He bought books about raising children. He came home early. He was there for the first smile and the first tooth, and the first unsteady steps across the kitchen floor. He took Nathan to the park every Sunday morning, and when Nathan learned to run, he ran beside him. He told Nathan stories at bedtime, long and detailed and full of adventure, the same kind of stories he had once told Emeka, though he did not allow himself to think about that. Vivian watched her husband become a father with a certain satisfaction. She had wanted this. She had chosen Richard carefully, a successful older man who had clearly wanted to rebuild after a difficult first marriage. A man who would be stable and present, and who had, she had noticed early on, a quality of desire to do better that she found reassuring. She built their life with care. The house in a better neighborhood, the right schools researched before Nathan was even 2 years old, the social calendar that placed them among the right people. She was good at this, the architecture of a certain kind of life, and Richard was glad to let her manage it because it freed him for the work. But Vivian had a quality that Richard, in his desire for a clean new page, had not fully read. She was a woman who needed to feel that she was the most important thing in her husband's world, and who expressed that need, not through warmth and openness, but through control and surveillance. Small things at first. Checking his phone when he left the room. Asking about his day in ways that were not curiosity, but audit. Making comments, wrapped in humor, about the women at his office or at events. Richard noticed these things, but told himself they were normal, that every marriage had its textures, that Vivian was simply someone who valued loyalty and expressed it intensely. He had spent 11 years in a marriage he had ultimately walked away from, without ever confronting the problems directly. He was not about to start confronting things now. So the years passed. Nathan grew. The company grew. The house got larger. The holidays got more expensive. And underneath all of it, beneath the surface of this carefully constructed new life, 3 children, in a house across the city, were growing up without their father, becoming people without him, building futures that he would not be part of, carrying in their bodies the specific and unresolvable knowledge that the man who should have been there had chosen not to be. And Richard Okafor, who had protected his bloodline, who had made the hard choice, who had started over and built again, sat at the dinner table with his son Nathan on a Tuesday evening, when Nathan was 4 years old, helping him with a puzzle, and felt, for just a moment, completely and unexpectedly happy. He did not yet know that the feeling would not last. He did not yet know that the thing he had built his second life on was already beginning, quietly, to crack. Clara had not planned to become the woman she became. She had planned, once, to be a wife and a mother, and perhaps, someday, to go back to the interior design work she had done before the children were born. She had not planned to be a woman who raised 3 children alone on a maintenance payment, and whatever dignity she could hold together. But plans were, as she had learned, simply the shape your hope takes before reality begins to revise it. She went back to work when Tobena started school. She had kept a few contacts from her earlier working years, women and men who remembered her as talented and organized, and she called them carefully, one by one, starting not with the biggest jobs but with the ones she was most confident she could handle. Because she had not worked in 6 years, and she was aware of that gap, and she was not going to pretend it wasn't there. She got a small residential project through a former colleague. She did it well. She got another. Within 2 years, she had a steady stream of small but respectable work. Within 4, she had a proper client list and a reputation in the city for interiors that were warm and thoughtful, and had a particular quality of feeling inhabited, of feeling like the space had been designed for the specific life of the specific person who lived in it. It was not glamorous. It was not the kind of success that made anyone's eyes go wide at a dinner party, but it was hers, and she had built it while making school lunches at 7 in the morning, and attending parent consultations, and driving to football practice, and reading Tobena's school play lines with him at the kitchen table at 9 at night. She had built it in the margins, and she was fiercely proud of it in a quiet way that she did not often speak about. Her sister Catherine came around often. Her mother, who had retired to the South Coast, came for school holidays, and took the children to the beach, and cooked enormous meals, and filled the house with the particular warmth that grandmothers carry. Her brother Dennis was a steady presence for the boys and had a softness with Adaize that came from understanding, as a man, that girls who grow up without their fathers sometimes need a male figure who simply shows up without conditions. The children saw Richard's absence differently, each one of them, in the specific way that the same event filters through different natures. Emeka, by the time he was 14, had largely completed the internal process of deciding that his father was not someone he would allow to affect him. He had done this not dramatically, not with anger or declaration, but with the quiet efficiency of someone doing necessary interior renovation. He had taken the space where his father had been and filled it with purpose. He was at the top of his year in school. He had started reading about architecture and structural engineering, with an intensity that went beyond academic interest, into something closer to passion. He wanted to build things. He understood, dimly, and then more clearly as he got older, that this desire to build was connected to his father in ways that were complicated, but he did not spend much time examining that connection. He simply worked. Adaize turned 13, the year her story won a regional writing competition open to all young people under 16 in the county. The prize was a modest cash award and the publication of her piece in an anthology. She came home with the letter confirming her win and handed it to Clara without much ceremony. Clara read it and put down what she was doing and held her daughter's face in both hands and looked at her for a long moment. Adaize did not quite know how to receive that kind of direct, unguarded love. She had learned to keep most of what she felt slightly below the surface. But she let her mother hold her face, and she held her mother's wrists, and they stood there in the kitchen for a moment, in the specific way that two people who have been through something together acknowledge it without words. Tobena went through a difficult period when he was 11. It lasted about 18 months and was marked by a drop in his schoolwork, a restlessness, and an irritability that was unlike him. Clara recognized it for what it was, a delayed processing of something that had been sitting in him since he was 5 years old, running after a car at the end of a driveway. She found him a counselor, a quiet and patient man who met with Tobena once a week for 8 months. She did not force Tobena to talk about what happened in the sessions. She simply made sure he went, and made sure the biscuit tin was full, and the house was warm when he came home. By the time Tobena was 13, the difficult period had passed, and he had come out of it with something that had not been there before. A quality of steadiness, a sense of himself as someone who had gone through something and survived it. He was not unchanged, but he was solid in a way that quiet pain, properly processed, can sometimes produce. Richard did not know any of this. He received the maintenance payment receipts. He had Clara's address, still the same family home. He had his solicitor's occasional updates on the legal arrangements. But he did not call. He did not write. He did not appear. His 3 children grew through their most formative years without a single conversation with their father about the things that mattered, about who they were becoming, about what they feared and wanted and hoped for. He did not know that Emeka had won a scholarship to a top engineering program. He did not know that Adaize's writing had begun to be noticed outside of school. He did not know that Tobena had gone through a hard year and come out the other side. He did not know because he had made a choice, long ago, to not know, and he had kept to that choice with the same discipline he applied to everything in his life. Vivian managed the household and Nathan's life with precision. Nathan attended a private prep school that cost more per term than Richard had earned in a year when he first arrived in England. He was a bright boy, sociable and confident, with his mother's looks and something of his father's drive. But he had also grown up in a household where money was the unspoken answer to every problem, where discomfort was managed away rather than sat with, where the goal of every situation was to maintain the appearance of success. These things shaped him. They shaped him in ways that would not become visible until later, when he was old enough to make his own choices, and those choices would reveal the values that had been quietly installed in him, year by year, without anyone intending it. Richard was 50 years old when Nathan started secondary school. He looked around at his life on his 50th birthday, which Vivian organized into a dinner party at their home for 30 people, with catered food and a jazz quartet in the corner of the sitting room, and he felt a satisfaction that was real, but not quite complete. He was proud of what he had. He was proud of Nathan, who sat at the table that night, looking handsome and comfortable in the way that children raised with abundance can look. He was proud of the house and the company and the reputation he had built. But there was a feeling underneath all of it, not quite longing, Not quite regret, something harder to name, like a sound, just below the frequency you can properly hear, present but not identifiable. He attributed it to age. He was 50. It was natural to reflect. It was natural to feel the distance between where you were and where you had hoped to be, even when where you were was objectively successful. He told himself this and accepted it and got on with things, because getting on with things was what Richard did. He did not yet know that in 3 of the 4 bedrooms in a house he no longer visited, 3 young people were building lives that bore the marks of his absence, the way a bone bears the mark of an old fracture, healed over but permanent, a record of something that had broken and been repaired. He did not yet know that the fracture in his own life was not yet healed, because the break had never been properly examined. He did not yet know that the evidence sitting in his coat pocket, the evidence on which he had built the last 9 years of his life, was not evidence at all. He did not know any of this yet. But the knowing was coming, and when it came, it would not come gently. Richard was 52 years old when he first began to understand that his second marriage was not what he had built it to be. It did not arrive as a single revelation. It arrived the way most uncomfortable truths do, in small, accumulating moments that you can ignore individually, but that eventually reach a weight you cannot carry without noticing it. The first moment was small. He came home from a trip to Edinburgh on a Thursday evening, 2 days earlier than expected because a meeting had been cancelled. The house was quiet when he came in. Vivian's car was in the drive, but the kitchen was empty, and the sitting room was dark. He assumed she was upstairs. He put his bag down in the hallway and went to the kitchen to get a glass of water, and as he stood at the sink he heard her voice from the garden, low and quick, through the slightly open back door. He was not listening deliberately, but the tone of her voice stopped him. It was the tone of someone talking to someone they do not want overheard, careful and close and intimate, in a way that had nothing to do with the way she spoke to her friends, or her mother, or anyone whose call he had ever been present for. He stepped back from the sink and stood very still. The call ended within a minute. He heard her footsteps on the garden path. He moved to the kitchen table and sat down and picked up a newspaper that had been left there and opened it to a random page. Vivian came in from the garden and stopped when she saw him, just briefly, a pause so short it might have meant nothing. Then she smiled and said she had not heard him come in. He said he had come home early. She said that was lovely. She put her phone in her pocket and went to the fridge and took out a bottle of sparkling water and poured 2 glasses and set one in front of him and sat across the table. He looked at her over the top of the newspaper, and she looked back at him, and the moment passed. He did not mention what he had heard. He told himself it was nothing. He told himself that the voice could have been anything, a friend, a work contact, someone from her book group. He told himself this because he was a man who had made a catastrophic choice once before, by not examining his reactions before acting on them, and he was not ready to examine why this particular small moment was making something cold move in his chest. But over the weeks that followed, he began to notice other things. Her phone, which had always been something she left on the kitchen counter or the coffee table without much thought, began to come everywhere with her. She started closing doors when she took calls. She was out more in the evenings, with reasons that were plausible enough individually, but that began, over time, to form a pattern that added up to something he did not want to name. He did not confront her. He watched. He processed. He filed things away. He had learned, from the experience with Clara, that confronting something directly meant having to deal with the answer, and Richard had a lifelong preference for certainty, obtained on his own terms. The difference this time was that he could not resolve the uncertainty himself. There was no letter, no investigator he had briefed, nothing that could be framed as evidence one way or another. There was only feeling, and Richard's relationship with feeling was complicated. Nathan was 13 by this time. He was a boy who moved through the world with the assurance of someone who had never been told no by life, which had made him charming, but not always thoughtful. He had a group of friends at school who were similarly positioned, similar backgrounds, similar expectations, and they operated collectively with the unconscious confidence of people who believe the world is organized in their favor. Richard watched his son and felt pride, and also, sometimes, a small, unnamed concern. Nathan did not seem to understand that things cost something, not just money, but effort, sacrifice, difficulty. He had never had to learn that lesson, because every difficulty in his life, had been smoothed away before he could encounter it properly. Richard recognized this and did nothing to change it, partly because Vivienne managed Nathan's world and Richard was not inclined to argue about it, and partly because some part of him had decided that Nathan's ease was the point, that the entire purpose of what he had built was that his son should never have to struggle the way he had. He thought about Emeka, on occasion. Not often, and never in a sustained way, but occasionally. A news article about engineering, a building going up somewhere in the city, a program on television about structural design. He would think, briefly, about the boy who had liked mathematics and asked too many questions. He would wonder, very briefly, what had become of him. And then the thought would pass, and he would do nothing about it, because he had spent a decade practicing not doing anything about those thoughts, and he was very good at it by now. The moment that cracked the foundation of his second marriage open came on a Saturday afternoon, when Nathan was at a friend's house, and Richard had spent the morning at his desk, going through work. He came downstairs to find Vivienne's bag open on the kitchen counter, her phone lying on top, screen lit with an incoming message. He was not looking. He was reaching past the bag for the kettle, but the screen was there, and the message preview was there, and the name attached to it was a man's name, and the 3 words of the preview he saw before the screen went dark were enough. He put the kettle down. He stood in his kitchen for a long time. He did not pick up Vivienne's phone. He did not read the message. He went back upstairs to his desk and sat down and did not do any work. He sat very still for a while, in the way that you sit when something you have been half expecting for a long time finally arrives, and the body needs a moment before the mind can catch up. Then he called his solicitor. The second divorce was different from the first. It was faster and much louder. Vivienne did not receive the news with resignation. She was a woman who fought, and she fought with everything she had, and some of what she had was information. She had been keeping a file on Richard's financial arrangements for several years, partly as insurance and partly out of the simple habit of a woman who believed in knowing where she stood. She had a very good solicitor of her own. The proceedings were heated and expensive, and unpleasant in the specific way that the end of a marriage can be when both people believe they are the aggrieved party. It was during one of the most difficult arguments of those proceedings, late on a Tuesday evening in the house that was now a battlefield, that Vivienne said something that changed everything. She was angry, and she was sharp when she was angry, and she knew which things would cut the deepest. She had found, months earlier in his belongings while looking for something else, a folder of old documents. Among them were 2 things. The first was Gerald's letter. The second was the inconclusive DNA test report. She had read them both with the methodical thoroughness she applied to everything. She had shown them to a doctor friend of hers, a woman named Patricia who specialized in genetics, partly out of curiosity and partly out of some instinct she could not have articulated. Patricia had looked at the report and explained, in clear and patient language, that inconclusive meant nothing, that the samples had been insufficient, that no conclusion of any kind could be drawn from this document. And then, because Patricia was thorough and had access to resources, and Vivienne had asked her to, Patricia had also arranged, over the following weeks, a proper test of her own, using samples she had obtained discreetly, from a source she did not explain to Richard. Standing in the kitchen of their failing marriage on a Tuesday evening, Vivienne looked at Richard with the eyes of a woman who is holding a weapon she has been waiting for the right moment to use, and she told him. She told him that the letter was written by a jealous man with no evidence. She told him that the DNA test he had relied on was not a result at all. She told him that Patricia had run a proper test, a real test, with proper samples, and that the result was absolutely clear, that all 3 of his children from his first marriage were biologically his. The room went very quiet. Richard looked at his wife. He looked at the anger in her face and the certainty in her eyes. He said nothing. She slid a copy of the document across the kitchen counter toward him. He did not pick it up. He looked at it lying there on the granite surface. 3 names. 3 clear results. 3 children who were his. He stood in his kitchen, and the world reorganized itself around him, into a shape he had not seen coming, and everything he had believed for 10 years, every justification he had built, every choice he had made, fell from the sky at once, and landed around him in pieces, and there was nothing underneath any of it, no solid ground, nothing that held, because it had all been built on a damaged sample, and a spiteful letter, and a fear that was never about Clara at all. He picked up the document. He read it slowly. He set it back down. He was 52 years old. He had 3 children he had not spoken to in nearly a decade. They were 21, 19, and 17 years old. They had grown up without him. He had removed them from his will. He had not attended a single birthday, a single school event, a single day of their lives after he walked out of that house. And he had done all of it, every single piece of it, based on something that was not true. Vivian left the kitchen. He heard her footsteps on the stairs. He stood at the counter alone, in the silence of a house that was ending. And for the first time in his adult life, Richard Okafor had nothing to do. There was no next step to execute, no action to take, no plan to move forward on. There was nothing. There was just the document on the counter, and the names of his children on it, and the years that could not be returned. He sat down at the kitchen table. He placed both hands flat on the surface. He sat there for a very long time. Outside, the evening was coming down. The garden was still. Somewhere down the road, a neighbor's car pulled into a driveway, and a door opened, and a child's voice called out, and was answered, and the door closed again, and the street went quiet. The ordinary sounds of people living their lives, going in and out of their houses, being expected and answered and welcomed. Richard sat in his kitchen, and the weight of what he had done settled on him fully, and it was heavier than anything he had ever carried. The months that followed the discovery were among the strangest Richard had ever lived through, and he had lived through several kinds of strange. He had grown up in poverty. He had rebuilt himself from nothing. He had walked away from his children based on a lie. But this period, these quiet, directionless months that came after the truth landed, was something different. It was the particular strangeness of a man who has lost the story he has been telling himself, and cannot yet find another one to replace it. The second divorce was finalized 6 months after that evening in the kitchen. It was expensive, and left Richard with a settlement that reduced his assets significantly. Though not catastrophically. His company was still solid. He still had his flat, which he had moved back into while the house was being sold. He still had his professional reputation, which had never depended on his personal life. He still had Nathan, who lived primarily with Vivian, but who spent some weekends with his father in the flat, eating takeaway food, and watching sport on the television, and having the particular kind of companionship that fathers and teenage sons can have, low-key and comfortable, and not especially deep. What Richard did not have was any clear idea of what to do about what he had learned. He thought about it constantly, in the mornings, over coffee, staring at the wall of his flat, on drives to and from the office, when the radio felt like an intrusion. Late at night, when sleep would not come, he turned the situation over and over in his mind, with the same focused, methodical approach he brought to business problems, looking for the leverage point, the step that unlocked the next step. But this was not a business problem. There was no leverage point. There were only 3 people, now adults, who had grown up without their father, and a father who had constructed his absence on a foundation of nothing, and no strategy that could bridge that gap cleanly. He thought about calling. He thought about writing a letter. He thought about asking his solicitor to make contact, and then felt the absurdity of that and dismissed it immediately. He thought about simply showing up, and thought about Emeka's face in the upstairs window on the day he left, and decided that showing up unannounced was not something he had the right to do. He Googled his children's names. He was not proud of doing it, but he did it, alone in his flat, at 11 at night, with a whiskey he was not drinking. He found very little about Emeka, who appeared to have a completed engineering degree, and a name that appeared on a company website for a mid-sized structural firm in the north of England. He found more about Adeze. There were a few literary mentions, a story published in a small magazine, a mention in a newspaper article about emerging young writers. He read what he could find of her work. He sat with the feeling that came from that for a long time. He found almost nothing about Tobena, who was still young, still becoming whatever he was going to be. He did not make contact. Not yet. He was afraid in a way that was new to him. He had spent his whole life cultivating fearlessness, or at least the performance of it. But this fear was different from any he had encountered before. It was not the fear of failure or loss or poverty. It was the fear of being seen clearly by people who had every reason to see him clearly, and to find what they saw unforgivable. It was the fear that he had forfeited the right to be heard, and that he would knock on the door of his children's lives and find it rightfully closed against him, and that he would deserve every inch of that closed door. His GP, a calm and practical man named Dr. Holloway, who had been his doctor for 15 years, noticed during a routine appointment that Richard was not sleeping well and suggested he consider speaking to someone. Richard said he was fine. Dr. Holloway looked at him for a moment in the way that good doctors do, patient and without judgment, and said that the offer was there. Richard thanked him and left, and drove to his office and spent the afternoon in back-to-back meetings, which was his preferred method of not thinking about things. He lasted 3 more weeks before he called the number Dr. Holloway had given him. The therapist was a woman named Linda Carter. She worked from an office in a Victorian terrace in the city, a quiet room with a plant on the windowsill and 2 chairs angled toward each other in the unhurried way of a space designed for honesty. Richard sat in his chair on the first session and looked at her and thought about all the ways he was going to manage this, how he was going to present the situation clearly and efficiently, and then receive advice on how to proceed. Linda listened to his opening summary with the expression of someone who has heard many first sessions and understands that what people say in the first 10 minutes is rarely the actual subject. She asked him, when he finished, how he was feeling. He said he was processing. She asked him what he meant by that. He was quiet for a moment, and then he said, with a directness that surprised him, that he had spent the better part of his adult life protecting something that did not need protecting, and in doing so, had destroyed the only things that genuinely belonged to him, and that he was sitting with the reality of that, and he did not know what to do with it. Linda did not say anything immediately. She let the statement sit in the room. Richard looked at the plant on the windowsill. He looked at the grain of the wooden floor. He looked at his own hands, placed palms down on his knees. He was 52 years old, and he was sitting in a therapist's office for the first time in his life, and the thing that was in his chest had a name now, and the name was grief. Not anger, not regret, though those were there too. Grief. The grief of someone who has lost people they loved by their own hand. Linda asked him to tell her about each of the children, not the situation, not the DNA test or the letter or the divorce. The children, what they were like, what he remembered. He started with Emeka. He talked about the way Emeka would carry a notebook everywhere by the time he was 7, writing down things he noticed, measurements and observations about the world around him, the way beams and girders fit together, the way staircases turned. He talked about the way Emeka would sit very still at the dinner table after everyone else had finished, working through a problem in his head with the focused stillness of a much older person, and how Clara used to say that Emeka was born 40 years old. He talked about the maths problem, how Emeka had come to him one evening with a problem from school, something about angles and ratios, and Richard had sat with him for an hour going through it, and the look on Emeka's face when he finally understood it, the pure and uncomplicated joy of a mind that has grasped something new. He stopped talking. Linda asked him to continue. He talked about Adeze, the stories she told at the dinner table that went on far too long, and were completely captivating. The way she would hold the room without knowing she was doing it. The drawing she had done when she was 5 of their house, which had captured every detail of the garden with an accuracy that had made Richard and Clara laugh with astonishment. The way she used to sit on his lap when he was reading and read over his shoulder, following the words with her finger. He stopped talking again. He looked at the floor. Linda did not rush him. He talked about Tobena. He talked for longer about Tobena than about either of the others, because Tobena was the one he saw in the dark at 3 in the morning. He talked about the shoulders, the small hands gripping his hair. He talked about the laughter. He talked about the running, and when he got to the running he stopped, and the silence in the room was complete. Linda said quietly that what he was describing sounded like love. Richard looked at her. He did not say anything for a long time, and then he said yes, he supposed it was. She asked him what had happened to it. He said he had locked it away. She asked him why. He said because he had believed something that was not true, and because he had been too proud and too frightened to ask the one question that could have shown him it was not true, and because a man whose entire identity was built on certainty could not afford to be uncertain about his own children, and so he had resolved the uncertainty in the worst possible way, by deciding and acting on the decision, and living inside the decision for 10 years. He said he had protected his bloodline. He said those words, and then he heard himself say them, and he fell quiet. Linda asked him what he felt when he said those words now. He said he felt that they were the most hollow words he had ever heard. He went back to Linda every Thursday for 4 months. She did not tell him what to do. She did not give him a strategy. She gave him, instead, a space in which to see himself clearly, perhaps for the first time. And what he saw was not a monster. It was something more painful than that. It was a man who had carried fear his entire life. Fear of loss, fear of failure, fear of being less than he had built himself up to be, and who had let that fear make the largest decision of his life, without ever once asking whether the fear was based on anything real. He was not a monster, but he had done something monstrous, and understanding the difference between those two things was, Linda told him, the only way forward. He began to think, carefully and slowly, about contact, not as a strategy, not as a problem to be solved, but as something he owed, if not to himself, then to 3 people who deserved at minimum to know that he understood what he had done. He wrote a letter to Clara first, not to ask for anything, not to apologize in the hollow way that demands forgiveness, simply to tell her the truth. About Gerald's letter, about the investigation, about the DNA test and how he had misread it, about what he had believed and what he knew now. He wrote it by hand, which was something he had not done in years. It took him 3 attempts before he had something he felt was honest, rather than strategic. He posted it on a Wednesday morning on his way to work and spent the rest of the day not thinking about it, which was to say he spent the day thinking about nothing else. Clara called him 11 days later. Her voice was controlled, but he could hear what was underneath it. She said she had read his letter. He said he knew it was not enough. She said that was correct. She said there were no words for what he had taken from them, not just from her, but from the children. She said that 3 people had grown up with a father-shaped absence in the middle of their lives, and that a letter explaining why could not fill it. He agreed. He did not try to argue. He did not try to justify. He listened, and when she had finished, he said he knew he had no right to ask for anything. He said he only wanted them to know the truth. He said he would do whatever they decided was appropriate. He said whatever that meant, whatever any of them needed, he would try to be what they needed, and not what he wanted. Clara was quiet for a long moment, and then she said she would speak to the children. She said she was not making any promises on their behalf. She said she was only telling him that she would speak to them. He thanked her. She said not to thank her. She said she was doing it for them, not for him. He said he understood. He put the phone down and sat in his flat in the evening quiet and felt something he had not felt in a long time. Not hope, exactly. Something quieter than that. Something that sat alongside the grief and did not replace it. He did not have a name for it immediately, but it had the quality of a man who, after walking in the wrong direction for a very long time, has finally turned around and is facing the right way, even though the distance remaining is still enormous. He was 52 years old. His children were 21, 19, and 17. He had missed the majority of their lives. He was going to have to learn to live with that, and whatever came next, whatever any of them would or would not give him, would have to grow on the soil of that reality, not despite it. The week after Clara called back to say she had spoken to the children was the slowest week of Richard's adult life. He had lived through difficult weeks before, weeks when the company was in crisis, when deals fell through, when money was short and the future was uncertain. But those weeks had always had action in them. There had always been something to do. This week there was nothing. He could only wait, and waiting was the thing Richard had always been worst at. He learned, in that week, what it felt like to have no leverage, no plan, no move to make. He had spent 30 years being a man who could always find a move, and now he was sitting in a flat in Birmingham at 52 years old, waiting to find out if the 3 people he had abandoned a decade ago would agree to hear from him. Emeka called on a Thursday. Richard's phone rang just before 7 in the evening, and he saw a number he did not recognize and picked up without thinking. When the voice on the other end said his name, he knew it immediately. Not because it sounded the way he remembered, it did not. It was the voice of a grown man, low and measured and careful. He knew it because some part of him had been listening for it for years, without admitting it. He said, quietly, that it was good to hear from him. Emeka said he was not calling because he forgave him. He said that clearly, immediately, so there was no confusion about what the call was. He said he was calling because his mother had told him what Richard's letter said, and he had questions that he wanted answered directly, not through a letter, and not through his mother. He said he deserved that much. Richard said yes. He said that was correct. Emeka asked why he had never come back. Not at first, Richard thought, meaning why he had left, why he had never come back, after the divorce, after the settlement, in any of the 9 years that followed. Why not a single call, a single visit, a birthday card that actually arrived on time? Richard did not try to explain it as a strategy. He said the truth, which was that he had believed something false and had organized his entire life around that belief, and that returning to his children while still inside that belief would have felt to him like admitting it was wrong, and he had not been able to do that. He said he understood that this was not a justification. It was just what had been true. Emeka listened. When Richard finished, there was a silence that lasted long enough that Richard began to wonder if Emeka had put the phone down. Then Emeka said that when he was 9, after Richard started pulling away, he had believed for a long time that he had done something wrong, that something about him had caused his father to stop loving him. Richard closed his eyes. Emeka said he had spent the next decade doing everything he could to be someone no one would choose to leave. He had worked harder than everyone around him, achieved more, demanded less. He had become, in many ways, the most disciplined and capable person in any room he entered. And then, when he was older, he had understood that the thing driving him was not ambition but fear. And he had spent several years working to separate those two things, the ambition from the fear, so that he could keep the first, without being controlled by the second. He said he had not needed his father to do that work. He had done it himself. Richard said he knew. He said he was sorry. He said sorry was not enough, and he knew that too. Emeka said he would think about whether he wanted any further contact. He said he was not closing the door, but he was not opening it either. He said Richard should not interpret this call as a signal that anything between them was resolved. It was not resolved. It might never be resolved. But he had wanted to say what he had said, and now he had said it, and he needed time. Richard said he understood. He said he would wait. Emeka said goodbye. Not warmly, but not coldly either. The way you say goodbye to someone who is neither a stranger nor a friend, someone who is something else entirely, something for which the language has not quite been invented. Richard put the phone down and sat in his chair for an hour without moving. Adaize did not call. She wrote. The letter arrived 10 days after Emeka's call. It was 4 pages, handwritten on unlined paper, in a small, clear script that Richard recognized had the quality of someone who wrote a great deal. He sat at his kitchen table and read it from beginning to end without stopping. She wrote that she had been waiting, without knowing she was waiting, for some explanation, not because it would change anything, but because not knowing why was its own particular kind of weight, and she had been carrying it for a decade, and she deserved to put it down. She said she understood now why he had done what he did. Understanding, she wrote, was not the same as accepting, and accepting was not the same as forgiving. She said those were 3 separate things, and she was somewhere in the vicinity of the first, and nowhere near the third. She wrote about what it had been like, the years of his absence, not with bitterness, but with the careful precision of someone who had spent years finding language for experience. She wrote about the father-shaped space in the center of her childhood. She wrote that she had put it in her stories, that every story she had ever written had someone in it who was looking for something they had lost and were not sure they would find. She said she had understood for a few years now that the thing her characters were looking for was something she herself was looking for, and that now she knew what it was. She said she did not know what she wanted from him. She said she had written the letter to say that she had read his, and that she knew the truth, and that she was going to take a long time to decide what to do with it. She said he should not expect to hear from her again soon. She said she was not disappearing, but she was not ready. She signed it with her name, just her name. Richard read the letter twice. He folded it carefully and put it in the drawer of his bedside table, next to no other letters, because he had always been a man who did not keep things. He lay awake that night thinking about her stories and the characters in them who were looking for something lost. He thought about what it meant, that a 19-year-old woman, who had grown up to be a writer, had spent her years filling page after page with the shape of his absence. He thought about what that cost. Not him, her. It was the first time he had thought about the cost to them rather than the cost to himself. It would not be the last. Tobena's response came not by phone or letter but in person, which was not what Richard had expected. Clara called him on a Monday morning and said that Tobena had asked if he could meet his father, Not in a family setting, not with anyone else present, just the two of them, somewhere neutral. She said Tobenna's word was that he had some things to say, and he wanted to say them to Richard's face. Richard said yes immediately. They met in a coffee shop near the train station, one of those large, anonymous chain places where you can sit for 2 hours without anyone paying you much attention. Richard arrived 10 minutes early and chose a table near the window and sat with a cup of coffee he could not taste and watched the door. When Tobenna walked in, Richard felt something in his chest do something he had not expected. Not because Tobenna looked like he had imagined. He did not. He was taller than Richard had thought he would be, broad-shouldered, with his mother's face and a quality of quiet self-possession that had nothing to do with either of his parents. He was 17 years old, and he moved through the coffee shop with the ease of someone comfortable in his own body, and when he saw Richard at the table, he walked directly toward him, without hesitation. He sat down. He did not extend his hand. He looked at Richard across the table, with eyes that were remarkably steady, for a 17-year-old meeting a father he had not seen since he was 5. He said he wanted to ask one question before anything else. Richard said go ahead. Tobenna asked if Richard had ever, at any point in the years since he left, missed them. Not thought about them out of guilt or obligation. Missed them. Actually missed them. Richard looked at his youngest son across the table in a busy coffee shop on a Tuesday afternoon, and said yes. He said he had missed them every day. He said the missing had been something he had learned to keep very quiet and very contained, because there was no use for it. It was not actionable. It could not build anything. And so he had packed it away and worked around it. But it had always been there. He said Tobenna especially. He said the running. He said he had driven away and heard Tobenna's voice, and he had kept driving, and that sound had never left him. He did not say this to produce an effect. He said it because it was true, and because Tobenna had asked a direct question, and Tobenna deserved a direct answer. Tobenna looked at him for a long time. Then he said that was both better and worse than he had expected to hear. Richard asked him what he meant. Tobenna said he had prepared himself for 2 possible versions of his father. The first was a man who had genuinely felt nothing, a man who had left because he did not care, and had felt no weight from it. That version he had decided he could handle, because it would mean the absence had been about a flaw in the man, rather than a flaw in himself. The second version was a man who had missed them and had still not come back, who had felt the weight of what he had done and had chosen to stay away anyway. He said the second version was harder to understand. Richard said he understood why. Tobenna said he had spent a lot of time in the last few years thinking about forgiveness. He said the word was used too easily and too quickly, in his experience. He said he had been told, by well-meaning people, that forgiveness was something you did for yourself, not for the other person. He said he understood that argument intellectually, but he said that what he felt, sitting across from his father for the first time in 12 years, was not yet forgiveness. He said it was something else. He said it was curiosity. He wanted to know who his father actually was. He wanted to understand how a man could hear his child running after his car and keep driving, not to excuse it, to understand it, because not understanding it had been its own kind of prison for a long time. Richard said he would tell him everything. He said if Tobenna wanted to know, he would explain every step of it, every decision, every reasoning, every lie he had told himself to make each step feel necessary. He said none of it would make him look good, but it would all be true. Tobenna nodded slowly. He said that was what he wanted. They sat in that coffee shop for 2 hours and 40 minutes. Richard talked. Tobenna listened and asked questions. Good ones. The kind that came from someone who had been thinking about this for a long time. He did not shout. He did not cry. He was not cold. He was simply there, fully and attentively present, receiving the story of his own abandonment from the man who had carried it out, and processing it in real time, with a maturity that Richard found both humbling and quietly devastating. When they finally stood up to leave, Tobenna put on his jacket and looked at his father for a moment. He said he was not going to pretend that this one conversation had changed things. He said healing, if it was going to happen, would take a long time, and a lot of honesty, and more conversations like this one, and even then he could not promise where it would end. He said he had a life. He had people who loved him. He had his mother, and his Uncle Dennis, and his friends, and his faith, and none of that was going anywhere. His father was a part of his story, but he was not the center of it. Richard would need to understand that. Richard said he understood. Tobena said goodbye. He shook his father's hand briefly and walked out into the afternoon, and Richard stood at the window of the coffee shop and watched him walk down the street, his son, a person he had played almost no part in making, but who had been made anyway, who had become this steady, thoughtful, self-contained young man, without a single day of paternal guidance, and Richard stood there until Tobena turned the corner and was gone, and then he picked up the 2 empty coffee cups from the table and carried them to the counter before he left, because he needed something to do with his hands. The 2 years that followed Richard's conversations with his children were not years of resolution. He had learned, by then, to distrust clean resolutions. Real things did not resolve cleanly. Real things shifted and settled and sometimes opened again when you thought they had closed. He had accepted that this was the terrain he was operating on, rough and uneven and without a guaranteed destination, and he had made the decision to keep walking it regardless. He had dinner with Clara 3 months after the coffee shop meeting with Tobena. It was Clara's idea, which surprised him. She chose a restaurant that was neither too casual nor too formal, a good middle ground place that signaled civility without warmth. She came with the particular posture of a woman who has thought carefully about every word she is going to say and the ones she is going to withhold. She looked, Richard noticed, more settled than she had looked in the last years of their marriage. She looked like someone who had found the life she was meant to have, not the life someone else's choices had imposed on her, but something she had built deliberately in the aftermath. She told him, over the first course, that she had not forgiven him. She wanted that clear from the beginning. She was not sitting across from him as someone who had processed and healed and arrived at acceptance. She was sitting across from him because she had 3 children who were navigating a complicated thing, and she believed, as their mother, that she could either make that navigation harder by refusing to engage with Richard herself, or she could make it slightly easier by finding a way to be civil. She had chosen civil. Richard said he respected that. She asked about Nathan. The question surprised him. He said Nathan was 17, and difficult in the way that teenagers whose parents had recently divorced tended to be difficult. He said Nathan was bright, but had not been shaped in ways that would make his life easy, that he had grown up in a household built for comfort, and had not yet developed the interior resources to handle discomfort. He said this without self-pity or apology. He said it the way a man says something he has understood too late. Clara listened and said nothing for a moment. And then she said, that was perhaps the one thing she and Richard had in common now. She had raised 3 children in difficult circumstances, who had become remarkably capable people. He had raised 1 child in comfortable circumstances, who was finding things harder than he should be. She said this without cruelty. She said it with the matter-of-fact clarity of someone who had done the maths and arrived at an uncomfortable answer. Richard said she was probably right. She said she probably was. They finished dinner with the careful politeness of 2 people who had shared 11 years and 2 divorces, collectively, and who were finding a way to be in the same room without weapons. It was not warmth, but it was something. It was a beginning of a kind. Emeka agreed to meet Richard 6 months after their phone call. He had taken his time, and Richard had waited without pushing, which was the hardest thing he had done in the entire process. They met for lunch in Manchester, near Emeka's office. Emeka was 21 years old and worked for a structural engineering firm where he had already, according to the company website Richard had looked at more than once, distinguished himself as someone to watch. He came to lunch in work clothes, direct from the office, with a slight distraction behind his eyes that Richard recognized immediately as the look of a man whose mind was still on the problem he had left. They talked carefully at first. Emeka asked questions about the company. Richard answered honestly, including the parts that were less successful than he might once have presented. Emeka had a precision in his questions that reminded Richard of the 9-year-old with the notebook, always measuring, always checking the structure. He asked about the second marriage, not intrusively but directly, and Richard told him the truth of it. He asked about Nathan. Richard told him about Nathan honestly too, including his concerns. At one point in the meal, Richard said, because it needed to be said, that he had been wrong. He said not just morally wrong but factually wrong, that the foundation of every decision he had made was a misreading of a flawed document and a belief he had never tested. He said he wanted Emeka to understand that there had been no aspect of Emeka himself, no behavior, no quality, nothing that the boy or the man had done or been that had factored into what happened. It had nothing to do with Emeka. It had been entirely about Richard. Emeka looked at him for a moment. He said he knew that now. He said knowing it now did not fully undo what it had felt like not to know it at 10, but he said he was working on that. He said working on it was his responsibility, not Richard's. Richard said he understood. He also said that he would like, if Emeka was open to it, to be someone Emeka could call if he ever wanted to, not to rebuild something that had been lost. He understood that what had been lost was not rebuildable, but perhaps to build something new, smaller and slower, and more honest than what might have existed, something that acknowledged what had happened rather than papering over it. Emeka was quiet for a while. He looked at the table, and then at the window, and then at his father. He said he would think about it. Richard said that was fine. He said he would wait. Adaeze and Richard did not meet for over a year after the letter. She was processing in her own time, and he had learned not to press. He heard about her life through indirect mentions. Clara would occasionally say something in passing, that Adaeze was working on something longer, that she had a meeting with a literary agent, that she had been asked to speak at a writing event. Richard received each piece of information and held it quietly and allowed himself to be glad for her without inserting himself into the gladness. When they did finally meet, it was at a reading Adaeze gave at a bookshop in the city. She had published a piece in a literary journal that had been noticed, and the bookshop had invited her to read alongside 2 other young writers. Richard heard about it from Tobena, who mentioned it in passing during one of their growing, irregular conversations. He did not ask if he should go. He simply looked up the event and went and sat in the back row of the small bookshop on a Friday evening with 40 other people. She read for 20 minutes. Her work was precise and unusual, and full of a kind of restrained emotion that was all the more powerful for its restraint. The piece she read was about a woman who finds a photograph of her father in the attic of the house she grew up in, and spends the story deciding what to do with it. Richard sat in the back row and listened, and he was not certain whether the story was about him or about something else entirely, and he decided that the uncertainty was appropriate. After the reading, there was wine and informal conversation. Adaeze moved through the small crowd with a quiet ease, talking to people who had questions about her work. Richard stood near the door with a glass of water and watched. She knew he was there. She had seen him when she came in, a brief glance across the room, long enough to register and no longer. He did not approach her. He waited. She came to him near the end of the evening. She stood in front of him with her arms folded lightly across her chest, not defensively, but in the way of someone who is composing themselves. She said she was glad he came. He said it was a privilege to hear her. She looked at him for a moment. She said she did not know what to do with him yet. He said he knew. She said she was going to keep writing. He said that was good. She said whatever happened between them, or did not happen, would find its own shape in its own time. He said he understood. She reached out and touched his arm briefly, just her fingers on his forearm, less than a second. And then she turned back to the room and went to speak with someone else. Richard stood near the door for another few minutes and then left. He walked to his car and sat in it in the quiet street outside the bookshop. The evening was cool and clear. Somewhere inside, his daughter was talking to people who admired her work. His daughter. He had not thought of her that way in 10 years, without also thinking of the weight attached to it, the guilt, the grief. But tonight, in the car, he let himself think of her as simply his daughter and nothing else, and what he felt was something closer to pure than anything he had felt in a very long time. He started the car and drove home. Nathan remained a complicated presence in his life. The boy had grown into a young man who was discovering, at 17 and 18, that the world did not naturally conform to the shape he had been given to expect. Vivienne continued to manage his life with the same precision she had always brought to it, and Nathan continued to be shaped by that management in ways that would take years to untangle. Richard made an effort to be more present with Nathan than he had been, not as a correction of the past, but as a genuine attempt to give his son something more than money and comfort. He took Nathan to visit a building site once, a large residential project, and showed him how structural plans became physical reality. Nathan was interested in ways Richard had not expected. He asked good questions. There was a mind in there that had not yet been pointed at anything it truly cared about. Richard began to understand, in his mid-50s, that fatherhood was not a thing you did once, and correctly or incorrectly, and then moved on from. It was something you could keep doing, imperfectly and incompletely, for as long as you were alive and willing. He had missed most of the time he should have had with Emeka and Adeyeze and Tobena. That was true, and it was permanent. But there were years still ahead, and whatever those years held, he intended to be honest in them. He intended to show up. Not dramatically, not with grand gestures that served his own need for visible redemption, just consistently, quietly, in the ordinary, continuing way that people show up for each other when they mean it. He set up a small charitable fund in the name of his company, directed toward educational support for children in single-parent households. He did not publicize it. He did not frame it as an act of personal guilt. It was simply something that needed to exist, and that he was in a position to make exist. Clara, when she heard about it through Tobena, said nothing to Richard directly, but Tobena mentioned that his mother had said it was a good thing. That was enough. On the morning of his 54th birthday, Richard woke up early in his flat and made coffee, and stood at the window looking at the city. The light was coming up slowly, pale and clean, the way early morning light in November does, gentle and without drama. He had no plans for the day. No dinner organized, no party. Nathan was coming over in the afternoon for a few hours, that was all. He thought about his life the way you think about something from a distance, trying to see the whole shape of it rather than any single part. He had come from nothing. He had built things. He had loved people and walked away from them. He had been wrong about the most important thing he had ever decided, and had spent a decade living inside that wrongness without knowing it. He had been shown the truth by the last person he had expected, in the worst moment of his second failure. He had spent the last 2 years trying to do something with that truth that was neither self-pity nor performance. He was not a good man who had made mistakes. That was too simple. He was a complicated man who had done serious harm, who had understood it, and who was trying, in the specific and limited ways available to him, to be something better. Not for credit, not for forgiveness, because the alternative was to live the remaining years of his life the way he had lived too many years already, in motion, in noise, in the performance of certainty, with grief and loss packed away in a winter coat where he could not see it. He did not want that. He finished his coffee. He washed the cup. He went and sat at the small desk near the window and opened a drawer and took out a piece of paper and began to write a letter to Emeka. Not about anything urgent, not about arrangements or plans, just a letter. About the engineering project he had seen on the news, about a building Richard had visited in Madrid years ago that had structural elements he thought Emeka would find interesting, about a maths problem a colleague's child had brought up that had made Richard think of a 9-year-old boy with a notebook. He wrote without expectation. He sealed the letter and put it aside to post later. He sat at the window and watched the city come fully awake. Somewhere in the north of England, Emeka was probably already at his desk. Somewhere in London, where Adeyeze had recently moved, she was probably writing. Somewhere not far from here, Tobena was probably at the church where he had begun to serve in a small volunteer capacity on Sunday mornings. His children were alive and moving through the world. They were not people he had made. They were people they had made themselves, out of the material available to them, which had included his absence and their mother's presence, and their own particular and remarkable natures. They had not needed him to become who they were, but they were in the world, and he was in the world, and the world was large enough to hold all of that, the damage, and the trying, and the distance still to go, without requiring any of it to be resolved before it could be faced. He would face it. Every day he woke up, he would face it. That was the only thing left that was entirely up to him. The spring that Tobena turned 18 was the spring that everything began to move in a new direction. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, but with the quiet accumulation of small things that, when you looked back later, you could see were all pointing the same way. Tobena had decided, over the previous year, that he wanted to study theology and social work, a combination that surprised some people, but made complete sense to those who knew him. He had found, in the years of his own difficult processing, that the questions he was most alive to were the ones that sat at the intersection of faith and human behavior, how people broke, how they repaired themselves, how community worked, and why it sometimes failed. He had a gift for being present with people in pain without flinching, the kind of gift that is usually born from having sat with your own pain long enough to lose the fear of it. He had applied to 3 universities. He had received offers from 2, He was weighing his options with the careful practicality he had developed over years of watching his mother make careful, practical decisions, without much margin for error. On the morning he needed to make his final choice, he called Richard. Richard picked up on the second ring. He had learned to pick up quickly when Tobena called, not because the calls were frequent, they were not, but because each one felt like something he had not earned and was receiving anyway, and he did not want to miss it. Tobena explained the two offers. He said the costs were similar. He said the programs had different strengths. He asked Richard, not for money, though Richard would have given it, but for his opinion on how to make a decision when both options had merit, but for different reasons. He said he was asking because Richard was someone who had made many decisions, some of them very wrong, and had presumably learned something about decision-making in the process. Richard sat down. He was in his office when the call came in, and his assistant was waiting outside the door for a meeting he was going to need to push back. He pushed it back. He talked to Tobena for 35 minutes about how to think through a decision when the rational factors were nearly equal, about the difference between choosing what was safe and choosing what was true, about the fact that some choices reveal who you are rather than determine it. He talked about some of his own decisions, including ones he had never talked about to anyone except Linda. He talked carefully and without flinching. Tobena listened in the way he always listened, completely and without interruption. When Richard finished, Tobena was quiet for a moment, and then said he thought he knew which one to choose. Richard said he thought he probably did too. Tobena chose the university that was farther from home, but had the better program for what he actually wanted to do. He said goodbye. He said thanks. He hung up. Richard sat in his office for a moment. His assistant knocked and opened the door and said the meeting could not be pushed back further. Richard nodded and stood up. He went into the meeting and ran it efficiently and well, because that was something he could always do. And the whole time something small and warm sat in the center of his chest and did not go away. Emeka called him 3 months later. This call was different from the careful, measured calls that had characterized their early contact. Emeka was dealing with something difficult at work, a disagreement with a senior colleague about a structural calculation he believed was wrong. He had a choice between pushing the issue formally, which could create friction, or letting it go, which felt dishonest. He laid out the situation clearly and asked Richard what he would do. Richard said he would push it. He said that compromising on something you knew to be structurally incorrect was not caution, it was a form of dishonesty, and dishonesty in structural work had consequences that could eventually be visible to everyone in the worst possible way. He said that the friction of being right was always preferable to the quiet of being wrong. Emeka said he was going to push it. He did. He turned out to be right about the calculation. His senior colleague was gracious about it in the end, as professionals often are when the evidence is clear. Emeka called Richard a week later to tell him how it had gone, which was itself a significant thing. The first time Emeka had called, not because he needed something, but because he wanted to share something. Richard received it carefully. He did not make too much of it. He did not treat it as a turning point or a moment of reconciliation. He simply listened and responded as one person responds to another when they are glad to hear good news. And when Emeka said goodbye and the call ended, Richard went back to what he was doing, and the call sat comfortably in the background of the afternoon, without needing to be assigned a meaning. But it had a meaning. He knew that. It just did not need to be spoken. He turned 53 in November of that year. He and Nathan spent the evening together at a restaurant Nathan had chosen. A decent place, not flashy. Nathan was 18 now, and had changed in ways that Richard was watching with interest. Vivian's influence on his life was being gradually counterbalanced by university applications and part-time work, and the simple fact that the world beyond his mother's management was becoming more real to him. He was discovering that things cost effort, and he was not collapsing under that discovery. He was adapting. Richard watched him adapt and felt cautious pride, the kind that does not make assumptions about what happens next. Nathan knew, by now, about the 3 half-siblings he had grown up not knowing he had. Vivian had told him during the divorce proceedings, in a way that was not kind, using it as ammunition in an argument. Richard had spoken to Nathan about it afterward, directly and without softening it. He had told Nathan the truth of what had happened, the same truth he had told everyone. Nathan had listened and said very little at the time, but he had asked, some months later, if he would ever meet them. Richard said he did not know. He said that was up to them, and that if any of them ever expressed interest, he would facilitate whatever they chose. Nathan nodded and let it go, in the way of a young man who is still figuring out where everything fits in the story of his own life. The question of Nathan meeting the other three remained open. It was not urgent, it was not pressing. It was just a door that existed somewhere down a hall that everyone was still walking toward. Adaeze published her first piece, in a widely read literary magazine, in the late spring of Richard's 53rd year. It was a short story, 30 pages, and it was reviewed by 3 critics, all of whom used language that signaled genuine notice. Richard read the reviews online. He found the story through a literary database a colleague's daughter had helped him access, and he read it over 2 evenings, carefully, the way he had once read engineering reports and deal proposals. The story was about a man who plants a tree that takes 20 years to grow and comes back to find it enormous and unknown to him, bearing fruit he did not plant for and cannot eat because he is a stranger to the tree now and must learn to stand in its shade without owning it. He closed the laptop and sat in the quiet of his flat for a long time. He sent her a message, short, without over-explanation. He said he had read the story. He said it was extraordinary. He said he was proud of her, and then he deleted that sentence and rewrote it, because he was not sure he had the right to be proud, and replaced it with a sentence that said simply that the work was remarkable and that he hoped she would keep writing. He sent the message before he could overthink it further. She replied 4 days later. She said thank you. She said she was working on something longer. That was all. But it was there. A line of contact, thin and fragile and entirely real. Tobena began his university studies in September. He moved into a shared house with 4 other students and called his mother on the first evening to tell her the kitchen was smaller than expected and someone had already used his shelf in the fridge. Clara laughed. Richard knew this because Tobena, who had developed a habit of mentioning small details of his life to Richard in their occasional calls, told him about it a few days later in passing, as if it were simply news to share. Richard listened and said the kitchen situation would sort itself out, and that the real challenge of shared living was learning to manage different levels of cleanliness in people who all believed they were the tidy one. Tobena laughed. It was a real laugh, easy and immediate, and Richard felt it like something physically warm. He was building something. He had accepted, fully and without illusion, that he was not rebuilding what had been lost. You could not rebuild what had been lost. The years his children had grown through without him were gone. The moments that had happened inside those years, the firsts and the daily ordinariness and the specific texture of childhood and adolescence, were over and could not be recovered. He was not trying to recover them. He was trying to create something new, something honest and slow and without expectation, in whatever time was left. He was 53 years old, and he did not know how much time there was. No one did. But there was some. There was today, and there was tomorrow. And there were the calls that came occasionally, and the letters he continued to write, and the door that had been slightly opened, and that he was standing near, with his hands at his sides, not pushing, not leaning, just present. The thing he had spent his life protecting, the bloodline, the legacy, the name, had turned out to be something quite different from what he had imagined. It was not in documents or company records, or the formal structures of inheritance. It was in a young engineer in Manchester who pushed back on incorrect calculations because he had learned that dishonesty in structural work had consequences. It was in a young woman in London who filled pages with stories about people trying to understand things they had lost. It was in a young man at university who had the kind of inner steadiness that only comes from having gone looking for yourself and found something worth keeping. They had built themselves. He had not built them, but they carried something of him. The drive, the precision, the hunger, to make something real. They carried it the way rivers carry silt, invisibly, as part of their own nature, not as a tribute to their source. He could live with that. He was learning to. On a Sunday in late October, he drove to the city center and walked for a while without a destination. He walked past the kinds of buildings he had spent his life developing, glass and steel and structure, things that looked permanent from the outside and required constant maintenance from within, which was, he had come to understand, true of almost everything worth building. He stopped at a small park near the cathedral and sat on a bench. A family was feeding ducks nearby, 2 parents and a very young child who kept throwing the bread in the wrong direction and being gently redirected. The child found this enormously funny and kept doing it. The parents laughed too, that particular parental laugh that is exhausted and genuine at the same time. Richard watched them for a few minutes. He did not feel the watch with longing or grief. He felt it the way you feel something that belongs to the world, ordinary and real, and entirely itself. He sat there for a while, and then he stood up, put his hands in his pockets, and walked back into the city. There are mornings when Richard wakes up, and the first thought he has, before anything else, is not about work or the company or the day ahead, but about his children. Not the grief of them, though that is still there, buried in the way that real things bury themselves over time, present but no longer in command. He wakes up and his first thought is simply that they are out there in the world, moving through their lives, and that he knows something of what those lives look like now, and that this is something he nearly forfeited permanently, and that it has been given back to him in a form he could not have imagined and did not deserve. He thinks about Emeka first, usually. Emeka had done something in the previous year that Richard had not expected. He had called, on a Thursday evening, not to ask for advice or share news, but to say that he had been thinking about the conversation they had had about the engineering project, the one Richard had mentioned in one of his letters, and that he thought Richard might find it interesting to see the site in person. He said his company was involved in a project in Sheffield, and that if Richard wanted to visit, he could arrange access and walk him through the structural work. Richard had said yes before Emeka finished the sentence. They had spent 4 hours on a construction site in Sheffield on a cold February morning, Emeka explaining the structural decisions, and Richard asking the kind of questions that came from his own years in property development, precise and informed, and occasionally catching Emeka off guard with their depth. Emeka had looked at him on 2 or 3 occasions with a surprise he did not bother to hide. Richard had not said anything about it. He simply asked the next question. At the end of the morning, they had gone to a nearby cafe and had sandwiches and tea and talked for another hour. Not about the project anymore, but about work in general, about what it meant to build something well, about the difference between structures that were designed to impress and structures that were designed to last. It was the kind of conversation Richard had had with business colleagues 100 times, easy and intellectually engaged and without pretense. Except that it was with his son, and it had the quality of something that was not yet comfortable, but was becoming possible. Emeka did not say it had been a good day. He said he would send Richard some papers about the project, technical papers, which was his version of saying something had been worthwhile. Richard received the papers and read them carefully, and sent back a response with 2 informed questions. And Emeka replied, and the exchange continued for several emails, technical and impersonal on the surface, and something else underneath. She had published 3 more pieces in the 2 years since the bookshop reading, each one noticed more than the last. Richard read everything she published, which required effort, because some of it appeared in places not easily found, small literary journals and online publications, and a piece in an anthology of new writing. He read it all. He said very little to her about it directly, because he understood that his opinion was not the point, and that the work did not need his validation. But occasionally he would send a brief message after reading something, not a review, not an analysis, just a sentence or 2 that indicated he had read it carefully. She usually replied with something brief. The brevity did not disappoint him. It was contact. It was real. The night her story was longlisted for a national prize, he found out from Tobena before she said anything to Richard herself. He sent her a message that said simply that he had heard the news and that it was well deserved. She replied within the hour. She said thank you. She said she was nervous. He said that was appropriate, and that nervousness, at a moment like this, was just respect for what it meant. She said that was a good way to think about it. He said good night. She said good night. He kept the exchange in his phone. He was not sure why, because he was not usually someone who kept things. He kept it anyway. He and Tobena had dinner together twice in the year following Tobena's first semester at university. The first time was in Birmingham, when Tobena was home for a weekend, at a restaurant Clara had recommended, though she did not attend. The second time was in the city where Tobena was studying, when Richard had business in the region, and Tobena had suggested meeting for food, after Richard mentioned he would be nearby. Both dinners had the quality of conversations between people who are still getting to know each other, which was the truth of it. And both had moments of something more than that, when the getting to know each other dissolved for a few minutes into something more direct and real. In one of those moments, at the second dinner, Tobena said that he had talked about Richard in one of his sessions with a counselor at university. Not the counselor he had seen as a child, but a new one, someone at the university's mental health service. He said that the counselor had asked him how he felt about the recent contact with his father. Tobena said he had told the counselor that it was like learning to use a muscle he had not known he had. Unfamiliar, and sometimes uncomfortable, but not painful, in the way that no contact had been, which was a different kind of pain, the pain of a muscle that had been kept completely still. Richard said he was glad it was not painful in that way. Tobena said it was not. He said it was just strange, and that strange was okay, and that he was getting used to strange. Richard said he was too. Nathan met Emeka on a Saturday afternoon in the spring of that year. It was not orchestrated or planned in advance. It happened because Richard had organized, very quietly, and with the help of a business contact, a visit to an engineering facility in Birmingham that he thought both of them might find interesting for different reasons. Emeka, for its structural aspects, and Nathan, because he had been expressing interest, for the first time, in sustainable building. He had told each of them separately about the visit, and about the other being there, giving each of them the choice to participate or not. Both had said yes. Richard watched his two sons walk through a building together on a Saturday morning. They were 3 years apart in age, 17 and 21, and they were nothing alike in the obvious ways. Nathan was taller and more expressive, with his mother's ease in conversation. Emeka was quieter and more methodical, moving through the space with the focused observation of someone who is reading a building the way other people read text. But they spoke to each other with the tentative, interested politeness of two people who are genuinely curious about each other and have no history of damage between them, because none of the damage that existed had anything to do with either of them. The damage was Richard's. They were simply two people meeting. At one point, Richard fell a few steps behind them and watched from a short distance as Emeka explained something about the load-bearing structure to Nathan, pointing upward at the beam configuration with his hands, and Nathan listened and asked a question, and Emeka paused and then answered with more animation than Richard had ever seen him use. Richard stood there in the middle of that building and felt something enormous and quiet move through him, not unlike what you feel when you have been bracing against something for a long time and it passes, and you discover that your whole body can release at once. He did not say anything about it. He walked forward and rejoined them, and they all had lunch afterward, in a place near the facility, and the conversation was ordinary and good, and nobody mentioned fathers or absence or the past. On the drive home that evening, Richard thought about Gerald. He thought about the letter he had received 11 years ago, the letter that a man with nothing to gain except the satisfaction of causing damage had sent to a house where 3 children were sleeping. He thought about what he could have done differently if he had been different, if he had been the kind of man who trusted, if he had been the kind of man who asked questions instead of making unilateral decisions based on fear, if he had been the kind of man who valued what he had over what he was afraid of losing. He had not been that man. He had become something closer to it, slowly and expensively, and too late for the years he could have had. But he was closer to it now than he had ever been, and the question he had learned to ask, the question he had taught himself finally to sit with, rather than avoid, was whether the man he was now was someone his children could eventually know without harm, not whether he could be forgiven. That was not his question to ask, but whether he could be present, honest, consistent and safe, whether the version of himself he had become through the long and painful process of seeing himself clearly was someone whose presence added something to their lives, rather than taking from them. He believed the answer was becoming yes, not because he had done enough. He had not. He had not done enough and would never have done enough, and he had accepted that completely. But because the children themselves, in their different ways and at their different distances, had not closed the door. They had left it open, slightly, in the specific way that people leave a door open when they are not sure yet what is on the other side, but are willing to keep looking. He drove home in the October evening, with the windows down slightly, the cool air coming in. He thought about the house he had left 11 years ago. He thought about the children in it, 9 and 7 and 5, and the moment before anything had gone wrong, when they had been simply a family in a house, ordinary and complete. He did not let himself stay in that thought long, because it was the kind of thought that served no one, but he let himself touch it once before letting it go. He got home. He parked. He went inside and made himself a cup of tea. He sat at his desk and found the letter he had been partway through writing to Emeka about the Sheffield project, and finished it, adding a note at the bottom about the day, about the building, about the way Nathan had asked that question. He sealed it and set it on the desk to post in the morning. He went to bed at a reasonable hour and slept, which was not something that had come easily to him in recent years, but which came more easily now. He had not earned peace. He understood that. Peace was not a destination he had the right to arrive at cleanly. But rest was something different. Rest was something he could allow himself between one day's honest effort and the next. He rested. In the morning he would get up and call Tobena, who had mentioned needing to talk through a decision about his second-year module choices. He would answer Adaeze's last brief message, which had contained a question about a writer she had seen him mention once, and wanted to know more about. He would post the letter to Emeka. He would go to his office and run his company, and come home and eat dinner, and read, and sleep. He would do these things not because they were enough, they were not enough, but because they were what was available to him. And what was available to him now was worth far more than anything he had spent a decade protecting. He had discarded his children to protect a bloodline, and the bloodline had never been in danger. The danger had been inside him all along, in the fear and the pride, and the inability to ask a simple question of the person sitting across the table from him every evening for 11 years. He had built a wall to keep something safe, and had destroyed the very thing the wall was meant to protect. The regret did not leave him. He had stopped expecting it to. It sat with him, quietly and permanently, the way a scar sits, something that has healed into the structure of you, and will not be removed because it is now part of what you are. He carried it not as punishment, but as information, as the constant, low reminder of what it cost to choose fear over love, certainty over honesty, pride over the simple human act of asking. His 3 children were in the world. He was in the world was large enough. He would show up tomorrow, and the day after, and the day after that. It was all he had left to offer, and he intended to give every bit of it.